Punchline is we think Solana has a really good chance to flip Ethereum this cycle. It just offers the most compelling combination of performance, price upside, yield on-chain usage. We've built DeFi Dev Corp with the sole purpose of being the fastest and most efficient way to accumulate Solana. We intend to become that leader.
Dan, I want to start by saying GM, and thank you so much for coming and chatting to us here at Solana Floor. We really appreciate it. You guys have been in the headlines lately. We've been covering you. A lot of other media outlets have been covering you. But before we dive into DeFi Development Corp itself and the growth and your insatiable appetite for buying more and more Sol, I want to start with just a quick question about you, because you started in TradFi, then you went to Kraken, right, which is a huge centralized exchange. And then I'm curious what drew you to Solana land through that process.
Yeah, I actually got, I would say, my first foray into Solana really through memes. And so towards the end of 2023, I would say like many others, I sort of found Bonk and Whiff and, sort of became bullish on those. And there's this whole backstory around why I'm bullish on memes, but that was really my first foray into Solana land, if you will. And then, it became a natural fit for DeFi Dev Corp because of that interest.
So explain to me that first brush that you had with memes and meme coins then. Is this when you were still working in Kraken?
Yeah, I wasn't the IR guy. So at the time I was on the corporate strategy team. And funny enough, this was about 6 months into my twin girls being born. And
congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. And I'm just there sleep deprived and, scrolling through my news feed. And then I find a headline that says, some trader made an insane amount of money on dog with hat. And I was like, I have to check this out, and I went and checked out the website. And I'm sure those of you who have been involved with WIF are very familiar with the site and, the strike through text and everything. I was like, oh, this is brilliant. I love this. And I just became sort of fixated on meme coins as a big theme to kick off the cycle. And before I knew it, I was a WIF owner, and won't say that I traded it perfectly by any means, sort of my story in crypto, but that was how I got involved.
I want to switch your attention here very, very quickly to DeFi Dev Corp, because we've been covering a lot of these treasury projects where you acquire as much Sol as possible. And there's comparisons, obviously, to Michael Saylor's strategy, and Sol Strategies is another one. But in as few words as possible, how is DeFi Dev Corp different than some of these other crypto treasury vehicles out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I like to tell people there's a handful of differentiators for DeFi Dev Corp. And maybe you get a few vehicles that come out and check one or two of those, what I call strategic edges, but there is no single vehicle in the market today, at least we believe, that checks all of those boxes. And I would start with probably the team. It's a crypto native team, all former Krakenites. I think that naturally comes with a lot of trust from other partners in the ecosystem, has enabled us to move really, really quickly. And we're not tourists in the space. So we're not here learning about Solana for the very first time. We're not here learning who the different players in the ecosystem are, which enables us to just move much faster than a lot of other players. And then I would say that being crypto native has allowed us to get pretty creative, maybe some innovations that other crypto treasury vehicles are not currently contemplating. We have nothing to comment on today, but you can imagine some on-chain TradFi crossovers that are in the works. So stay tuned.
Yeah, I need you to help me understand here something, Dan, because I'm not a mathematician by any stretch of the imagination, but I can do words, right? I think I'm pretty good at words. So when you guys come out and you do interviews and you say things like, we as DeFi Development Corp plan to acquire Sol to infinity, well, what does that mean? What does that entail?
Yeah, it really means as far as the market will allow us. We've built DeFi Dev Corp with the sole purpose of being the fastest and most efficient way to accumulate Solana. So that means to the extent that the market will enable us to, acquire it really fast through a combination of equity or debt raises, we're going to lean on those different instruments. Now, which instrument we lean on is very market dependent. We've spoken about this before, where to the extent that our equity is trading at a premium to the underlying Solana holdings that we have, we're likely to lean more in on equity. And to the extent that that multiple compresses, which it does during, I would say turbulent times or bear markets, we're more likely to lean in on convertible debt. But the beauty of this model and the way we've designed it is, even if we did no capital raises at all into the future, we have an underlying validator business that enables us to keep acquiring Solana. So we're not actually dependent on external capital to go and acquire more Sol. It's just the fuel on the fire, if you will.
On the validator statement, is there any plan? Can you talk to anything about acquiring more validators? I know Sol Strategies has been looking into that as well, or will you focus more on adding more SOL to your own validator?
Yeah, I would say our focus right now is certainly on acquiring more delegation. There's not going to go and rule out the possibility of acquiring more validators in the future, but I think our single North Star is accumulating more Solana on a per share basis. And we think securing more delegated stake is certainly a path to get there. To the extent that we have, excess cash on hand, you can imagine we're going to deploy that more into SOL, discounted locked SOL, rather than necessarily going out and acquiring a bunch of validators. I sort of like to think of this as like a sliding spectrum, if you will, and focused on either SOL accumulation or acquiring more validators. We've obviously, announced our purchase of Bull Moose systems for $3.5 million. So, we do think that is an important part of the business, but you shouldn't expect us to go out and acquire, 5, 6 more or something like that in the near future.
That makes sense. And the main reason why I was asking that, and I have been curious for quite a while reading articles by my colleagues covering you guys, is that if we think about SOL strategies and micro strategy now just strategy, SOL strategy specifically has the name of the asset in the name of the company, right? So they're sort of limited in terms of what they can do there with Treasury, I suppose. But for you guys, you don't have that limitation. So I thought to myself, what's stopping these guys, 2 years down the line from acquiring a bunch of SUI and, going down a similar route with different assets, just an example, SUI. But is that something you guys have discussed at all with the core team, or is it exclusively Solana for the time being?
It's a great question. I would say it's exclusively Solana for the time being, but a few years down the line, if for some reason the fundamentals on Solana drastically changed, or we realized that there was another really good opportunity that presented itself, we would certainly consider it in the future. But I think the intent is to keep this vehicle, DFDV vehicle, purely focused on Solana accumulation for the time being. And to the extent that other assets become interesting, it's likely we would set up a separate vehicle to become a pure play on that asset, so that this one stays true to our mission of acquiring SOL per share to infinity, as we like to say.
What makes you guys as bullish as you are on Solana specifically? Because you seem to be more bullish on Solana than some of the degens and the Sol maxis out there, right? Not just buying the asset and staking and getting exposure to Sol, but finding all these creative financial mechanisms to get even more exposure to the appreciation of the asset. So yeah, what makes you guys as bullish as you are?
Punchline is we think Solana has a really good chance to flip Ethereum this cycle. It just offers the most compelling combination of performance, price upside, yield, real on-chain usage. It's faster and cheaper than ETH. It powers a wide range of sectors, from DePIN to Memecoins, as we previously mentioned. And then obviously has the native yield component, which is really important. So look, Bitcoin is the best store of value on earth, but to the extent that you wanted to launch a Bitcoin treasury vehicle today, you've got to compete with the, huge giant that is MicroStrategy. And to our benefit, at least with Solana, there is no runaway clear leading player today, which we think, opens up the field, and we intend to become that leader.
That's exciting. I want to ask you also about the impact of all of this growth on the stock value, because the share prices have gone up. I think it's about 3,000% in 6 months, which is staggering, mind-blowingly impressive. So first of all, how does that make you guys feel in terms of, have you validated the main hypotheses that you had as far as the business model? Or was there something surprising in there where you thought, okay, maybe by the time we get to 500,000 SOL, this will be the share value? Or was it a surprise, or did you know exactly that this was going to happen because you had the right idea and the right plan and the right execution?
Look, we can't say we knew exactly what was going to happen. And obviously the market has reacted very positively to the change in treasury strategy that we announced once we acquired the legacy Janover business and obviously rebranded to DeFi Dev Corp. But we knew there was going to be some positive reaction. Now, this kind of gets to the underlying question of, how do crypto treasury vehicles trade? How do you justify multiples on NAV premiums? And while I can't comment on our equity specifically being over or undervalued, one thing that I'll note for investors is to think of a lot of the valuations in this space as not being tied necessarily to the present holdings that exist on the balance sheet, but rather being tied to that management team's ability to continue acquiring the underlying asset in the future. So not too dissimilar for the way that you would pay for future earnings in a traditional equity, or like, Google or Microsoft or something like that. Investors seem to be assigning value to future crypto accumulation for these crypto treasury vehicles. So as long as you're bullish on the underlying asset, actually it makes sense to me that a lot of these valuations exist where they are today. And you could even see a scenario where they expand rather than contract.
Interesting. So if I was to tie it all into me then, who's, I'm just a guy, I'm looking to get exposure to various assets out there. Sol is something that's very interesting to me. I want to get as much long exposure to Sol as possible. How is what you guys offer at DeFi Development Corp better for me than just buying Sol through, Phantom or SolFlare or whatever app that I happen to use on my phone day to day, and staking that, maybe getting some more out of it by liquid staking it and then lending it somewhere else. But yeah, how is it better to do this than just using the apps that I already have on my phone?
Yeah, I like to think of us as ruthless at optimization. So this means that we can acquire Solana more quickly than, call it, an average retail investor. And it means that we have access to certain strategic advantages and avenues to acquire Solana. So a great example of this is, the partnership that we announced with BitGo, whereby we're able to buy discounted locked SOL in the market. And that almost immediately secures unrealized gains for shareholders. And that's something that, again, unless you were an average retail user who had millions of dollars and you were doing trades at an OTC desk, wouldn't necessarily be available to you. Touching on the validator piece, our validators, Parker White has been operating validators for years, has managed to optimize for, performance on those validators. So we're generating yields that are, again, 20 to 40% above yields that you would get on a centralized exchange. So again, I like to think of this as almost like MicroStrategy meets active management, if you will, whereby you are not just paying for the underlying holdings, but you're paying for the expertise of the team to keep accumulating that asset at a more rapid pace than you could on your own.
That makes a lot of sense. So before we get into the risk, I have a question for you about risk. I want to just unpack this SOL per share growth, which it says on your website is the key metric that you guys are pursuing. Why is that the key aim, and how does that deliver the maximum value to people that want to support you guys, want to invest?
Yeah, I like to tell folks that SOL per share is a North Star because in theory, if you were just aiming for absolute Solana growth on the balance sheet, you could dilute existing shareholders indefinitely by just issuing a bunch of equity, whether or not you were trading at a premium to your underlying net asset value. And each shareholder in that kind of scenario would, in theory, have less SOL per share over time, even if the absolute value of Solana holdings were growing. So we wanted to be really thoughtful about ensuring that everything that we do makes sure that a week from now, a month from now, 1 year from now, each of our individual shareholders is accumulating more Solana. And I honestly usually answer this question in the context of ETFs, where folks often ask me, like, what's the difference between you guys and a Solana ETF in the future? When I tell them is that ETFs are pegged 1-for-1 to price and then the buck stops there. If you're to go and buy one, unit of an ETF, you're not necessarily going to have more Solana in that 1 year from now versus today, right? You're subject to inflows and outflows. You're obviously subject to whatever fees the underlying issuer charges. Versus with us, if you go and you buy one share of DFDV, you can bet that a month from now, a week from now, a year from now, we're going to accumulate more Solana on a per share basis. So we think that's a pretty important distinction versus some of the other vehicles that exist in the market.
Very quickly here, I want to think about where we are, in terms of market cycles as well. What was previously stopping companies from getting into this SOL treasury craze? Is it a shift in regulatory outlook? Is it the White House? Yeah, what's changed and why is this happening now?
It was purely regulatory, right? If you went and you tried to do this a year ago, a couple of years ago, all of a sudden you're a 40 Act company and the SEC is coming to your door and the whole business gets shut down. So we really think that was the primary hurdle that was preventing a lot of companies from putting cryptocurrencies on their balance sheet. Obviously, MicroStrategy did this with the OG asset Bitcoin, right? But it was sort of widely accepted that Bitcoin was a commodity for quite some time versus these other ones. I would say there was, again, a year ago, thinking back to a completely different world from a regulatory perspective in the US, much more debatable. And you were not going to put your business at risk at the time, even though it obviously presented a compelling opportunity from a returns perspective, particularly if you're bullish on crypto. That's obviously changed since the election. We now have a completely different regulatory environment in the US with the most pro-crypto Congress we've ever had, changes at the SEC as well. So it's now an easier statement to make that something like Solana is not a security, and therefore it's not surprising to me to see other companies, other crypto treasury vehicles rise, putting different assets on their balance sheets.
Clear. And while we are still sort of lightly on the topic of the SEC, DFDV staked about 48 million SOL recently, and you guys also, I think, filed for a $1 billion B shelf with the SEC. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Am I getting that correct?
we filed for a $1 billion shelf. That was just a filing, an application has not been approved.
Yeah. Fair enough. Aside from the timeline there, I wanted to ask you, I was talking with the editors about the Treasury vehicles, and one of the questions that we couldn't quite answer between us, even from research, is are you essentially kicking the capital markets door sort of wide open to fund endless purchases of SOL here? And in the longer run, I know you mentioned avoiding diluting shareholder value there, but maybe just getting back to that slightly. Yeah, how do you avoid that more specifically, and without becoming just a sort of perpetual fundraising machine in the long run?
Yeah, in the long run, look, I mean, I mentioned this at the beginning. In theory, we don't have to rely on any capital raises whatsoever, given our underlying validator business is cash flow positive, has an average about 500,000 of delegated stake. But we announced a partnership with Kraken whereby we can secure up to 4.5 million of delegated stake. And you can imagine there are other partnerships in the works as well. And as Solana ETFs come to market, and then eventually staking gets approved for those, being a trusted player in the space can only help us in that regard. But look, I mean, I think the playbook is similar to MicroStrategy in that we will likely depend on equity raises when we've got a premium to NAV, and probably lean more on converts as that multiple to NAV compresses. But we think there are just some more innovative ways that we can go about fundraising in the future besides just relying on those vehicles. So obviously, us filing $1 billion shelf is a signal that we want to have that flexibility and capacity to lean in on the ATM when conditions are right. But it's not like we have to completely rely on that for this model to work.
Well, let's say in 2 years from now, there's 5 or 6 new crypto treasury vehicles, all trying to be the Michael Saylor of the MicroStrategy of XYZ. How does that play out for you guys in terms of being able to fundraise at that point? Is that a risk, or do you think enough new capital will be around that the pie just gets bigger exponentially?
I think the pie will get bigger. We think it's a major validation, actually, of what we're doing, that more folks are going to come and try to do this. Our objective, as we mentioned, is to acquire Solana on a per share basis to infinity. But that means that inherently we want to become the market leader, and we think there's advantages to being the first mover and being the scaled player, just like MicroStrategy was for Bitcoin. I expect that as more of these vehicles come to market, the ability to tell your story, be really transparent, be shareholder friendly, be really innovative is going to matter much, much more. Versus today, I think you're seeing in a lot of instances just a lot of euphoria and speculation. And, I would say the field is almost wide open for who the leader is going to be. So ultimately, the market will reward whoever is going to do this, not just the fastest, but in the most disciplined way as well.
Before I let you go, you've got the hat on. I have to ask about the hat. Are we bullish WIF? Are we bullish bonk? Are we bullish memes in general? What's going to happen in the next 6 to 12 months, Dan?
I am bullish memes in general. This is not a DeFi Dev Corp view and not financial advice. But yeah, I mean, I mentioned this memes kicked off the cycle in many ways. And, I think for me personally, memes continue to be a really great way for folks to get into the ecosystem. They continue to be a great way for, I think, folks to enter crypto more broadly. And I've mentioned this on several other interviews, but I think memes are probably like the most passionate way to express peaceful rebellion within the broader financial system. And yeah, hard not to be bullish in that context.
I will be quoting you on that. Dan, thank you so much for making time to talk to us today. I really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of the week in New York City for Accelerate, and I hope it's fruitful. I hope we catch up very soon, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.